Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. A thick envelope arrives, formal, threatening. A man's self-built home anchored by legacy is suddenly under siege by a rich HOA armed with forged maps and polite malice. But they picked the wrong man. This isn't about property lines, it's a war over the truth, and it's only begun. I still remember the exact moment when the first letter arrived, sitting on my workbench between a coil of copper wire and a half-finished steel bracket like it belonged there, as if threatening a man in his own home was just another line item on an invoice. The envelope was thick, overly formal, stamped with the polished insignia of Pineview Estates, a name that already carried the smell of money and entitlement even before I tore it open. Inside was a carefully worded demand informing me that my house, the one I had designed, poured, framed, and finished with my own hands, apparently encroached on their newly established boundary line by several feet and must be relocated to ensure compliance with updated cadastral coordinates. I read the sentence twice, then once more out loud just to be sure I wasn't suffering a stroke or hallucinating bureaucracy. Relocate my house. Like I could just unbolt the foundation, slide the walls over like a misplaced couch, and call it a day. My first instinct was to laugh. A deep, dry laugh that echoed against the timber beams of my workshop. Then I walked inside and pulled out the metal file cabinet that held every document connected to this land. Deeds, surveys, photographs, blueprints, the original boundary markers my grandfather helped hammer into the soil decades before any manicured HOA fantasy existed in this valley. Everything lined up perfectly. The legal map from the county showed my property exactly where it had always been, the borders fixed and recorded long before Pineview Estates had even learned how to pronounce the word yurt. I drove into town, straight to the clerk's office, and had them pull the official parcel data on screen. The clerk, a tired man with wireframe glasses and a voice like sandpaper, confirmed it without even blinking. "Your plot hasn't shifted in generations," he said flatly. "If anyone's lines moved, it wasn't yours." That should have been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Back home, I drafted a response that didn't even bother with pleasantries. I informed them in plain, unambiguous terms that my property was not subject to their association, never had been, and any attempt to set foot on it again would be treated as trespassing and handled accordingly. I even added a small flourish, a little linguistic middle finger, suggesting that if they truly believed they could command a man to move his home, they might want to relocate their expectations somewhere warmer and significantly lower. The following afternoon, the sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me away from calibrating my forge. A glossy black SUV rolled up like it owned the view, and out stepped a woman who looked engineered to dominate charity boards and ruin shopping holidays. Karen, as she introduced herself with a tight smile, flanked by a clipboard-carrying assistant who nodded at everything she said like a mechanical bobblehead. She spoke about community standards and harmonizing the landscape, as if my house was some rogue freckle marring her perfect cosmetic surgery of a neighborhood. I didn't invite her to step closer. She did anyway, heels tapping against my stone path with the authoritarian confidence of someone who had never been told no in her adult life. I let her finish her speech, every calculated syllable dripping with the assumption that compliance was inevitable. Then I pointed toward the fence line and calmly told her that she was standing on land protected by law, love, sweat, and a man who didn't relocate his spine for decorative zoning fantasies. She called my position uncooperative. I called hers delusional. Her assistant scribbled furiously as if documenting a potentially violent zoo exhibit. Karen's smile thinned. "You'll hear from us again," she said, voice polished but strained, like a diamond with microfractures. I tilted my head, glanced at the house behind me, then back at her. "Make sure your GPS is working when you do," I replied. "Wouldn't want you confusing reality with corporate imagination again." She left with a stiff nod that tried desperately to pass as composure, but her eyes betrayed the spark of irritation that always precedes bad decisions. I watched the SUV disappear down the dirt road, unease settling somewhere behind my ribs. Not fear, not doubt, just a calm awareness that people who talk that way rarely follow the rules they pretend to worship. I left the property that morning with a shopping list taped to my dashboard and the lingering irritation from Karen's visit still buzzing in my head like a stubborn wasp. The forge needed new ceramic insulation. My hydraulic press had been coughing like a 70-year-old smoker, and I had every intention of ignoring the delusions of Pine View Estates while I handled real, tangible work. As I rolled down the dirt road toward town, my phone chimed with a motion alert from one of the newly installed cameras. I glanced at it briefly, saw only a pixelated blur near the fence line, and assumed it was another curious rabbit or the wind bullying a branch. I dismissed it and kept driving, unaware that I was granting them a window wide enough to crawl through. 50 minutes later, I turned back onto my driveway, and time seemed to misfire. A white utility truck with the Pine View logo was parked crookedly near my front porch, its hazard lights flashing with the smug confidence of bureaucratic legality. Two more vehicles sat beside it, their beds piled with ladders, crowbars, and neatly stacked bundles of unfamiliar lumber. I didn't even kill the engine before I saw movement on the roof. Men, boots scraping, metal clanging. A section of my shingles lay peeled back like torn skin, exposing the underlayment I had sealed myself less than a year ago. My front door was resting against the grass, hinges twisted, and a panel of siding had already been stripped away down to naked framing. For a heartbeat, the world went mute. Then instinct kicked in. I slammed the door open, grabbed the shotgun stowed behind the seat, and stepped out into open daylight that now felt hostile. They noticed me instantly. A man halfway up a ladder froze, mouth open. Another one dropped a crowbar that hit the ground with a hollow thud. I didn't point the gun at anyone directly, but I sure as hell made it clear I wasn't holding it for decoration. "You drop everything and get off my house right now," I barked, voice echoing across the field with a sharp edge honed by disbelief and adrenaline. "This is private property. You are trespassing, and you are done." One of them tried to speak, held up a clipboard like a holy relic, and stammered something about authorization and scheduled compliance. I cut him off before he could finish his sentence. "The only schedule you're on is the one where you leave before this gets uglier than a county fair pig contest." That line earned me a terrified look from the youngest worker, who promptly missed a step on the ladder and tumbled backward, landing in a mess of rakes and tangled extension cords. No satisfaction, just confirmation that chaos had officially moved in. They scrambled down, tripping over their own equipment, stepping on one another's panic as if Pine View Estates had hired a crew trained exclusively in bad decision-making. My dog was barking from the direction of the rear yard, and that's when I noticed the freshly installed wire enclosure that had absolutely not existed this morning. Someone had penned him in like an inconvenience. That sight burned hotter than the stripped roof. I pulled my phone out and dialed the sheriff's office without lowering the shotgun. My voice stayed level, controlled, the kind of tone that told the dispatcher this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a boundary violation carved in daylight. As the workers gathered their tools, muttering about liability and management orders, one of them had the nerve to ask if they could finish securing the structural adjustment. I stared at him, slow, deliberate. "You touch another nail on my house, and you'll be explaining that philosophy to a judge," I said, and he decided talking wasn't worth the risk. By the time the sirens echoed down the road, the Pine View truck was already reversing in a cloud of dust, retreating like a coward with a clipboard. I lowered the gun, stepped back, and looked at the damage they'd done in less than an hour. My home, my work, my sanctuary, treated like a movable error on their corporate blueprint. And for the first time since this started, I didn't feel just insulted. I felt methodically targeted. The sheriff arrived with that cautious expression worn by men who know property disputes in rural Colorado tend to end with paperwork or headlines, and never much in between. He stepped out of his cruiser, slow and deliberate, eyes scanning the scene like a seasoned carpenter judging a crooked beam. His deputy followed, younger, sharper, already taking photographs of the gouged siding, peeled shingles, and the front door abandoned on the grass like a carcass the vultures forgot to finish. I lowered the shotgun completely and rested it against the truck, keeping my hands visible. I wasn't about to give Pineview the satisfaction of calling this a standoff. They walked the perimeter while I explained exactly what I had come home to, showing them the camera footage on my phone, rewinding it until the timestamp proved these men had rolled in while I was barely 40 minutes down the road. The deputy let out something between a whistle and a curse when he saw how casually they'd climbed onto my roof, like it was an unpaid vacation rental. The sheriff didn't raise his voice, didn't even blink much, just nodded slowly and said the word I already hated hearing: civil dispute. Still, he instructed the remaining worker, the one who lingered behind to collect a toolbox, to vacate immediately and never return without explicit judicial authorization. The man nodded so hard I worried he'd dislocate something. I wasn't done. As soon as the dust settled, I drove straight to town and retained legal counsel, a woman named Eleanor Briggs. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of attorney who spoke quietly because she didn't see the need to compete with noise. She listened, reviewed the footage, studied the letters from Pineview, and the fake coordinates highlighted in fluorescent arrogance. When I mentioned the shotgun, she raised an eyebrow, but didn't flinch. "You didn't point it at anyone," she said calmly. "You established a perimeter. That matters." The court filing from Pineview arrived before sunset the next day. They were not just trying to spin the incident, they were trying to bury me under paper and plausible morality. Their complaint accused me of threatening employees, causing emotional distress, and obstructing lawful maintenance orders. According to them, the workers had a mandated task of rectifying an illegal structural placement, and my aggression had resulted in physical injury to one of their team. Apparently, tripping over his own panic was now being billed as trauma. I read the document twice, then once more just to appreciate the boldness. They painted me as an unhinged recluse, armed to the teeth, defending stolen ground with frontier theatrics. And, the cherry on top, the pièce de résistance of manufactured legality was their newly revised survey, showing my foundation nudging into Pineview territory, as if the earth had politely reshuffled its bones to suit Karen's ambitions. Eleanor tapped the paper with her pen, eyes narrowing. "This isn't about your house," she muttered. "This is about precedent, expansion, and control." I could already see it now, a pattern forming like a hairline crack in poured concrete. If they could bully one property into submission, the rest of the valley would bow at the clipboard. That realization settled into me like cold iron, not fear, not panic. Just the very clear understanding that this was no longer a petty dispute over lines on a map. It was a calculated play, and they'd chosen the wrong man to treat like movable scenery. The first thing I did the morning after receiving Pineview's lawsuit was drive back to the land office, not because I doubted my own records, but because I wanted every single fact reinforced by voices that had nothing to gain from Karen's corporate fantasy. I met with an independent surveyor named Harold Mercer, a grizzled old professional who had been walking lines and pounding stakes since before Pineview Estates was even a glint in a developer's eye. When I showed him their newly issued corrected map, he squinted, tilted his glasses, and let out a slow, skeptical hum that sounded like a man discovering someone had glued chrome rims onto a tractor. He pointed straight at a marker coordinate and said, "This anchor point doesn't even exist in the field. Someone drew this with ambition, not a compass." We walked the borderline together, boots crunching through dry brush, as Harold carefully compared his instruments with my original monograph readings. The results were exactly what my gut already knew, but needed validated beyond suspicion. The lines had been artificially shifted, not by erosion or natural drift, but by deliberate recalibration. He showed me where the supposed updated stake had been driven into soft soil that still hadn't settled, like a flag shoved into undecided ground. "Someone wanted your home to move because they didn't want to move their paperwork," he muttered, tapping the soil with an irritated toe. While Harper compiled his formal report, I hired a private investigator recommended by Eleanor, a quiet, meticulous woman named Valerie Jenkins, who made it her specialty to follow the money trail no one else wanted to admit existed. Within 2 days, she'd tracked down the survey firm hired by Pineview and confirmed that the company responsible for the altered measurements was partially owned through shell subsidiaries by one of Pineview's own board members. It wasn't just sloppy ethics. It was a circular business loop camouflaged as professional independence, the kind that smiled at inspectors and shook hands with legal plausibility. By midweek, a letter arrived from an anonymous source slipped into my mailbox. No return address, no formal signature. Inside was a scanned copy of their internal coordination sheet, a private memo outlining a planned rectification boundary adjustment, marked clearly in my area, dated weeks before they'd ever contacted me. They hadn't stumbled into a dispute. They had targeted it, engineered it, and then rolled trucks onto my property like they were fulfilling civic responsibility instead of orchestrating a quiet land grab. I stood in my kitchen holding that document, coffee cooling into bitterness, while my mind ran through every image of Karen's polished smile, every condescending word about community integrity. Outside, the half-stripped roof creaked gently in the wind, a reminder of how close they'd gotten to rewriting my reality with a ladder and a forged signature. And somehow, underneath the anger, a sharper clarity took root. The more I uncovered, the more methodical their scheme appeared, and the more certain I became that they had underestimated the wrong line in the wrong man's life. By the time Eleanor and I sat down in her office again, the mess had stopped feeling like a chaotic insult and started behaving like a hostile acquisition plan. She spread my evidence across the table with the precision of someone building a legal firing line. Harold's verified survey, Valerie's financial trail, the anonymous internal memo hinting at premeditation, and the fresh photographs of my half-rated roof glinting under the courthouse fluorescent lights. Outside her window, traffic flowed like nothing in the world had shifted, while my property had practically been treated as a testing ground for corporate muscle memory. "We're not just defending you," Eleanor said, tapping the edge of a document with her finger. "We're forcing them to prove every centimeter of their fantasy." I liked the sound of that. It felt less like retaliation and more like returning gravity to a dishonest equation. We filed a counterclaim that afternoon: trespass, destruction of private property, fraudulent manipulation of boundary records, attempted unlawful seizure. Each count stacked neatly, not as emotional indignation, but as precision cuts. Eleanor instructed me to keep every interaction clinical and recorded from that moment forward. No theatrics, no speeches. Let their confidence hang itself. Pineview, however, took a different approach. Instead of backing down, they pivoted to performance. Within days, glossy flyers began circulating in the outer community, framing me as an armed agitator obstructing necessary development. Karen appeared on a local suburban podcast discussing resistant outliers who refused modernization, referring to me indirectly as a safety concern. I watched the clip with a cup of reheated coffee and had to admire the gall. She spoke about harmony like someone trying to sell peace while bulldozing a church. Eleanor advised silence. I obeyed, but silence doesn't mean inactivity. I scheduled an independent structural assessment of my house, documenting every damaged brace, shifted beam, and compromised exterior segment they'd caused. The engineer, a man who technically spoke in equations, described the intrusion as reckless destabilization. I preferred the term vandalism with a power drill, but I kept my commentary to myself. Valerie returned with more information. Board members of Pineview had quietly discussed expansion incentives with town officials over private lunches. There were emails referencing strategic corrections along my boundary zone weeks before the letter ever arrived. I read each line with a slow, incredulous smile. The stupidity of conspiracies isn't that they exist. It's that people keep paper trails like they're romanticizing their own future incarcerations. In the middle of all this, Karen sent me a surprisingly cordial email proposing a private settlement discussion, suggesting this entire ordeal could be resolved amicably and discreetly. The restraint in my reply was almost heroic. I declined and added that any further communication should route through legal counsel. Then I blocked her number because I prefer my phone free of self-important hallucinations. Late that evening, standing under the half-moon behind my house, I walked the perimeter, inspecting the newly planted markers Harold had verified. The land hadn't changed. The silence hadn't changed. Only the pressure had thickened, like air before lightning. I wasn't intimidated. I wasn't flattered either. I was simply aware that somewhere beneath Pineview's polished facade, the machine had started to grind improperly, and they hadn't realized yet how much torque they'd applied in the wrong direction. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale paper, the kind of place where truth either sharpened or suffocated depending on who spoke first. I sat beside Eleanor as Pineview's legal team entered with the confidence of people who believed their own press releases, Karen leading them in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my truck. She flashed a practiced smile toward the gallery, as if this were a networking brunch instead of a hearing about illegally dismantling my home. I returned the gesture with the faintest nod, the kind you give someone who just stepped on your foot and insists it's community choreography. Eleanor began with controlled precision, laying out the foundation of our defense not as emotional outrage, but as undeniable sequence. She introduced Harold's sworn testimony first. The old surveyor approached the stand, steady as bedrock, and explained in plain language how Pineview's revised measurements contradicted every official record in the county archive. He pointed out the false anchor location, the inconsistent scale, and the digitally altered overlay that had been passed off as updated data. When Pineview's attorney attempted to suggest environmental shifts or geological movement, Harold gave him the dry smile of a man who had watched dirt behave honestly his entire life and said, "Land moves slower than your argument, son." Next came the engineering assessment of my house, diagrams projected across the courtroom screen showing structural points that Pineview's workers had compromised. The expert outlined how their intrusion had weakened support beams and posed real risk of collapse under seasonal strain. Karen shifted slightly in her chair as the description grew less theoretical and more damning. The term reckless destabilization hung in the air like a professional indictment. Then Eleanor called Valerie. My investigator laid out the web of corporate interests between Pineview and the survey firm with crisp clarity, tracing ownership through subsidiaries and proxy entities like connecting arteries back to a single, self-serving heart. Emails were read aloud referencing strategic boundary realignment and corridor optimization directly affecting my parcel. The judge's expression hardened as Valerie calmly stated that all these communications predated Pineview's original claim of error. This had never been a misunderstanding. It had been a rehearsed maneuver. Karen requested to speak, and the court granted it. She described the incident as an unfortunate escalation over a miscommunication, insisting that her association had acted out of logistical necessity, not malice. But Eleanor allowed the noose to tighten slowly. Under cross-examination, Karen contradicted herself twice regarding the timing of the survey approval and once more when describing who had authorized the work crew to enter my land. By the third inconsistency, even the stenographer seemed to pause, hands hovering over the keyboard, as if surprised by the narrative gymnastics. The judge called for a brief recess. I remained seated, watching Pineview's legal counsel whisper urgently, while Karen stared at her notes like they might confess for her. For the first time since this began, her composure frayed, not in anger, but in that subtle way ambition disintegrates when exposed to daylight. When court resumed, Eleanor formally requested the matter be reviewed under criminal scrutiny, citing evidence of intentional fraud and collaborative deception. The judge did not issue a ruling yet, but his tone shifted, no longer that of a mediator, but of a man now cataloging potential violations of law. The air in the room changed density, heavy with implication. I leaned back as proceedings adjourned for the day, fully aware that this was no longer just about my house. What had started as audacity had matured into exposure, and Pineview Estates had begun walking into the echo of its own decisions. The second day of hearings opened with a different energy, heavier, quieter, as if even the fluorescent lights sensed the narrative had turned from dispute to dissection. The prosecution had joined as an observer by order of the court, and that alone shifted every posture in the room. Pineview's attorneys suddenly looked more like accountants preparing for an audit than warriors defending a cause. Karen sat straighter, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the benches as if searching for applause that refused to arrive. Eleanor leaned slightly toward me and murmured that the court had requested supplemental documentation from the county records office overnight. I already knew what that meant. Someone had taken a deeper look, and when government offices start digging into their own archives, it's rarely to admire the dust patterns. She rose and introduced the new evidence with measured calm, a time-stamped record showing when the altered cadastral map had been uploaded into the system and by whom. The login credentials trace back not to a neutral reviewer, but to a temporary access token approved through a Pineview-affiliated consultant who, according to Valerie, shared a direct financial link with one of the association's directors. The judge leaned forward just slightly as the implication landed. His voice carried no accusation, only clinical precision. He asked Pineview's counsel whether they wished to contest the authorization trail. The silence that followed said more than argument ever could. Karen shifted, lips parting as if words might rewrite the air itself, but her attorney touched her sleeve gently, urging restraint. It was the kind of gesture reserved for people about to make a situation worse by attempting charisma. The court allowed Eleanor to call one final witness. A former administrative clerk from the survey firm testified via video link, her voice steady but lined with the tension of someone who had spent weeks weighing consequence against conscience. She described how certain reports were revised under instruction, how original field data was realigned to match coordinates supplied by an external source, and how her objections had been dismissed under the explanation that it was for community. Optimization, she didn't accuse. She simply recited procedure, and that made it devastating. Karen's smirk never returned. When the lunch recess was called, Pineview's legal team retreated as a unit, murmurs sharp, posture fractured. I remained seated, hands folded, eyes forward. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt observant. Like a man watching a structure crack under pressure it insisted on pretending could not exist. Outside the courtroom, 2 local reporters waited, microphones ready, curiosity packaged as professionalism. I declined to comment. I didn't need the camera to legitimize what the records already condemned. In the afternoon session, the judge addressed the scope of the dispute directly. He questioned Pineview's authority, their procedural compliance, and the rationale behind initiating physical action on private property without formal court sanction. Every answer offered on their behalf stumbled between vague authority and scripted denial. It became clear that their internal narrative had been built on bravado and assumption, neither of which aged well under scrutiny. As the session closed, the judge announced that the matter would be referred for further review beyond civil consideration. His language remained formal, unreadable, but the undertone was iron. Pineview Estates wasn't just defending a mistake. They were now explaining intent to a system that did not appreciate theatrical zoning fantasies. Karen left the room without looking at anyone, her heels no longer striking dominance, only urgency. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked past the bench without ceremony. There was no need for expression. The story no longer required one. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass beside the courthouse steps just as it always had. Calm, indifferent, patient. The land did not change. People did. And some of them, it seemed, were finally being held to account for the audacity they'd mistaken for authority. The final hearing did not unfold with drama. There were no raised voices, no theatrical smashes of gavels, no desperate outbursts designed for headlines. Just wait. A slow, undeniable gravity that pressed down on the courtroom as if the air itself understood the decision had already been reached, and everyone present was simply witnessing its descent into permanence. I stood beside Eleanor, hands loosely clasped in front of me, while the judge adjusted his glasses and delivered his findings in a voice that carried the calm inevitability of bedrock shifting beneath careless construction. Pineview Estates had entered my property without legal authority. They had altered official records with demonstrable intent. They had dismantled sections of a private residence based on fabricated pretenses and internal manipulation. Each statement landed with surgical clarity, not as accusation but as conclusion. He referenced specific acts, time-stamped entries, the coordinated alteration of survey data, and the unlawful deployment of a demolition crew. What they had done, he explained, exceeded civil negligence and entered the territory of calculated deception, professional misconduct, and criminal liability. The phrase intentional misrepresentation echoed once, then again, followed closely by willful fraud, as if the room itself needed time to absorb words usually reserved for things that collapse banks, not quiet mountain homes. Karen's expression shifted slowly, like porcelain cracking beneath heat. The practiced confidence she wore like armor finally splintered, revealing something raw underneath, something unprepared for consequences that did not respond to charm or authority. When the judge turned his attention toward her and the senior board of Pineview, her jaw tightened, then softened. Her gaze fell to the polished floor, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she looked like a participant in reality instead of a director of it. The judge did not theatrically call for handcuffs or officers, but his referral of the matter to the district attorney's office carried undeniable gravity. He outlined which elements required criminal review, citing potential filings for property damage, falsification of records, conspiracy, and violation of state zoning statutes. His tone never once rose, and somehow that made the verdict feel heavier, more permanent. This was no emotional reprimand. This was systemic refusal to tolerate manipulation masquerading as governance. When court adjourned, no one spoke. Karen and her attorneys exited without ceremony, their silence loud enough to fill the corridor. Eleanor placed a subtle hand on my shoulder before offering one calm sentence. "This ends the legal fight. What comes next is accounting." Valerie gave me a small nod, an acknowledgement between professionals who understood that truth, once documented, no longer needs its defenders present. Outside the courthouse, the sky felt broader, the light more grounded, not victorious, just clean. A new stillness, like the moment after thunder when the air forgets how to tremble. The reporters gathered, cameras poised, curiosity sharpened into performance. I declined with a glance and a shake of my head. I had no interest in being translated into sound bites. The land had already spoken louder than any microphone could manage. Back home, the reconstruction began with quiet efficiency. Specialists I trusted moved through the framework with measured focus, reinforcing beams, replacing compromised sections of roof, resecuring weather barriers my hands had originally installed with care. I walked each room with them, not out of control, but respect. This house had never been a structure to me. It had always been continuity, and no amount of forced plan revision or corporate assertion was going to turn it into a negotiable module. Each nail driven back into place felt deliberate. Each sealed seam reaffirmed a line that had existed long before Pineview learned how to market ambition. And when the repairs were complete, I took it upon myself to set new boundary markers along the perimeter. Thick concrete posts, driven deep into unyielding soil, their surfaces carved with clarity that did not require interpretation. Private property, not subject to HOA authority. Words formed not to provoke, but to remind. On the front gate, I fastened a smaller plaque, subtle yet unmistakable, its edge touched with humor, sharpened by experience. Not relocatable, not negotiable, still standing. A line meant not for conflict, but closure. In town, Pineview's name began appearing less on neighborhood invitations and more in legal digests. Their reputation softened into cautionary reference, a footnote in overreach, a corporate whisper of how not to conduct acquisition by intimidation. I didn't follow the proceedings closely. Their consequences were no longer my concern. My interest had returned to silence, to repair, to uninterrupted winter mornings, and unchallenged property lines. As the evening settled over the ridge, the sky washed itself in muted blues and soft silver. I stood on the porch, the renewed roof whispering gently above, my dog curled in steady sleep beside me. The valley looked no different than it ever had. The stars refused to acknowledge zoning disputes or board memberships. I poured myself a drink, let the glass catch the last stretch of fading sunlight, and allowed one thought to surface without triumph, without bitterness, just clarity. If someone ever demands that you move your house, make sure they bring more than paperwork, and an apology with real weight behind it.